Mhm.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to be learning with our colleague Josh Cahan today on Dayeinu, recovering a unique story and theology. Promises to be a very exciting session. So if you're out there in the Zoomverse and you can turn on your camera, that would be lovely. And we hope that you participate and enjoy learning each other. Josh, take it away.
All right. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are. Um, it is really an honor to be teaching about the. I now have all of these things I have in my computer that offer to do AI things for me, and I have to keep having to just close them out. um, uh, I'm so happy to be sort of learning with you a little bit about the Haggadah. I've been kind of immersed in Haggadah for a while, and it's nice for everyone else to sort of finally be ready to join the insanity. Um, my family's Purim costume was a set of T-shirts about Pesach, right? And with a label saying what? Too soon? Um, uh, So, as I think you know, I just completed and published a new Haggadah. The Yedid Nefesh Haggadah. Here's my one of my many copies of it, actually, for the moment. Um, and aside from just the excitement of sort of having a project and having it now out there, I found that going through the Haggadah, sort of the Haggadah text carefully in order to create the book, I realized all of the ways in which I in which I hadn't sort of paid careful attention to or really made sense of the complexities and sort of richness of the text. That there are so many places where year after year we kind of like read through stuff without really processing, and that there's just all this richness in different places, uh, just kind of waiting to be mined. So, among other things, one of the goals of the book, um, and I'm happy to kind of uh, talk a little more about the book more generally at the end if people are interested. But one of the goals of the book generally, and what I hope we'll do with Dayeinu today, is to give a little bit of a navigation guide, so that as you go through Magid, you have a sense of what each text is doing, how it's connected to the things before and after, how the different pieces fit together into kind of a coherent and nuanced whole, uh, which is an experience that's very different than I think what many of us associate with going through the Haggadah. Uh, so, with that kind of introduction, I want to talk about Dayeinu. Dayeinu, I think, was for me one of the texts that I really needed to be reintroduced to more than many of the others. But so just to start, like, I wonder how many of you have ever, how many of you have taught about Dayenu, or tend to talk about it with your in your shuls, in your communities. How do you tend to think about it?
Into stuff.
Well, just in terms of being a part of the Haggadah where we um, continually say thank you to God, and being cognizant of it forces us to sort of be cognizant of all the times that we have that God sort of, in theory at least, stepped in and said, I'll take care of it. It's a kind of a thank you and a reminder at the same time. And that's how I've sort of presented it to my congregation before.
Great.
Yeah, I struggle with it because on the one hand, I want it to just be gratitude, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that any given line actually is true. Would it really be enough if only one, or if we'd stopped at an earlier stage and not actually completed the full piyut? Like, is that enough?
True that. Yeah.
I've always been bothered by that. Any other just like kind of what are the main things you kind of associate with this text?
Well, I mean, getting very basic, it's a fun time at the seder, where just that it's the one song that everybody, no matter where they came from, they know, they somehow know it.
Right.
Yeah.
Everyone knows it. It is easy to learn, even if you don't. It's all the way at the end of Magid, so it's both fun and a sign that we're almost the meal. I think it's attractive and kind of we think I always categorized it as a children's song essentially, because when I thought about it in terms of its specific content, it was something between simplistic and implausible. But hopefully we will.
If we don't take it literally, that literally we're supposed to say Dayeinu would have been enough. Maybe it's supposed to teach us that we can be okay with partial, with some of it. We don't need the entire. Not that we don't need the all the different things that it talks about in our history, but just in life, sometimes we can be okay with getting some of what we want or most of what we want and be grateful for that and not having to have the whole thing.
Right. So there is something, right? There's something about being grateful for whatever things we get, even when we don't get everything that we want or think that we need. And something and a piece about noticing each individual part of that journey and kind of appreciating each one. But let's take a look at the text. And there are essentially three things that I want to do. The first is to kind of give you a different frame for just the meaning of the refrain of the word Dayeinu. Because just sort of reframing that word can give us a whole different language for how to sort of encounter this text. And then I want to kind of think about it in the context of and kind of alongside two psalms that are also kind of lists of God's deeds that I think Dayeinu, which is a much later text, Dayeinu is a text from the Talmudic or even early Gaonic period, but two texts that I think it is drawing on and responding to, and hopefully those kind of two comparisons will give us a better picture of Dayeinu's kind of role at the Seder and its kind of overall message and viewpoint, and what it coming there at the end of Magid, what it adds to the telling that we've done up to it. Okay, so I'm going to look at the word, and then I want to kind of look in turn at each of these two psalms. I'm going to do a little share screen here. This document is also, I think we're going to put it in the chat. Oh, we have it in the chat. So I will have it up here. You are welcome to open up your own version. But So you'll notice the first 4 pages of this are Dayeinu and then Psalm 136, which will kind of be our first foil. But I'm going to go to the first of the sort of additional sources over here and see if we can trace kind of how the rabbis actually use this term. So as far as I can tell, the uses of the term Dayeinu that appear in rabbinic literature stem from a verse in Malachi, chapter 3 of Malachi, where God is lamenting Israel neglecting the temple gifts, Trumot and Masrot. And then God promises that if the Israelites will bring all of the proper gifts to the temple, you'll see, I will eftach lachem et arubot hashamayim. I will open up kind of the floodgates of heaven with sort of the richness of rain, and I will pour on you bracha ad bli dai. I will pour down you bracha ad bli dai. I actually didn't translate that phrase because in the English here, kind of leave that open. But ad bli dai means either without end or unstinting. But the Yerushalmi, talking about that phrase, what's ad bli dai? It's either efshar lomar dai hu bracha. It's impossible to get enough of. But the second idea is ad sheyivlu siftotechem, ad bli dai, until your lips are worn out saying Dayeinu brachot. We have enough. We are full of brachot. So right there you have Dayeinu brachot. Right. What you're giving us now is filling us up. But but now look, jump up to the top of the top of that page to this great text from the Bavli. The Bavli is talking about various kinds of special kinds of brachot, and Rabbi Adin bar Rav Ada asks in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, Mipnei ma ein perot ginosar b'Yerushalayim. Why don't there's this whole in various places they talk about these special, extremely sweet fruits called perot ginosar that are associated with the Kinneret. Why are there no perot ginosar in Yerushalayim? Why don't they grow there? Why don't they have them there? And the answer is that people who are coming up to Jerusalem to make aliyah l'regel, to the temple on the pilgrimage festivals, shouldn't say, wow, these fruits are so amazing that il malay lo alinu el echol perot ginosar b'Yerushalayim, if we had only made the trek from wherever we live to Yerushalayim just to eat these fruits, Dayeinu, that would have made the trip worth it. Now, here, Dayeinu doesn't mean, they're certainly not saying, if I only had perot ginosar to eat in life, that would be enough. If I'd only come to Jerusalem for this, that would have made the trip worth it, right? These fruits are so special that they would merit their own trip. Now, it is now in this context, Bavli's saying, well, if you feel like these fruits would have made the trip worth it, then you're no longer coming to Jerusalem just to do the mitzvah. And so you're undermining the mitzvah. But the meaning of the term is really what's important, because what it means is that Dayeinu is functioning here as this thing is so special that it alone would make the travel or the effort worth it. And that actually I'm quite convinced what it means in the context of the Haggadah. Not if you'd only done this, it would have been enough for me. Because almost all of the Haggadah up until this point, is not focused on telling the story in this kind of in the way that the book of Shemot tells the story. The whole sort of saga narrative. Haggadah is focused on listing and enumerating and recounting the things that God has done for us, for which we should be expressing gratitude, thanks, and feeling in God's debt. And for each of those things, for each of the different things that God did, as we sort of make this list, we say, Dayeinu. Not Dayeinu, it would have been enough for me, I wouldn't have needed anything more. It's just that one thing would have merited unending gratitude. Just that one thing was so amazing and such an act of kindness and generosity that it itself is worthy of pouring out things. And then the next thing, that too, because lest we should think that, well, we're going to be grateful, God, for having brought us out of Egypt. And each one of those things was a special thing, and needs to be recognized separately as an act that's worthy of gratitude. I'm going to now go back here. The thing that makes that confusing, and here I would say, it feels to me like this is about, it's more that the wording is confusing. That when it says, if God had taken us out of Egypt, the lo asab, and if God had done this and hadn't done that, well, it does feel like we're saying, well, if God hadn't done, if God had brought us out of Mitzrayim and not done all these things to the Egyptians, we would have been happy with that, and that, right? But I don't think it actually means that. I think it means in the way that the fruits of Yinos are, right? Obviously it didn't
merited the trip. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, I didn't come to Jerusalem only to eat these fruits, but these fruits are so wonderful that they alone would have merited the trip. Right? Each of these things, I obviously didn't want God to do only some of these things. What I want to say is each one of these things is sufficient to merit singing God's praise. Okay, I'm going to pause there for any sort of comments, reactions, thoughts, and then.
Well, so then I'm wondering, how do you then, read a verse for me that way, so that I can kind of understand how you're presenting it. I mean, I understand in concept, but I don't know how it actually applies to the song itself.
So when I any place that we have text that sort of make lists of God's acts of might or acts of kindness, the idea is that we should be in awe and wonder, right? If we had only seen God, sort of parting the sea, and we hadn't seen God doing anything else, we should be feeling both grateful and kind of in awe of God's majesty, right? If the only thing, if you're only thinking about the way that God sustained us in the desert, separate from giving us the Torah and Shabbat and etc., right? Just the miracle of sustaining us for 40 years in the desert is amazing and deserves to have we should pause on that and be like, that in and of itself is amazing and something to really to really kind of recall and to feel, and should be like, that should be that should be appreciated on its own, separate from and then ultimately in combination with all of these other things, right? This one thing without the other things would have been enough to merit singing God's praise. Right? Right. I think getting away from the idea that it's about would have been enough for us, right? We would have been fine if God hadn't done the next thing. I'm getting away from that framing. I really think of it as it would have been enough. That on its own would have merited thanks and praise. I think it kind of breaks us out of that. Well, this is a weird kind of message.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so so we have biblically and in other sources, there's a whole genre of list of God's deeds, for which we should feel gratitude, or for which the Israelites didn't feel sufficient gratitude. Some of those lists focus exclusively on the Exodus. Many of them touch on the Exodus as part of a larger list. This I said is a later list, but the text that it's most similar to, kind of structurally, just in the very simple, on the most basic sense, is a text that is familiar both from davening Shabbat and from later in the Haggadah. So what I want to do now is we're going to sort of jump over to Psalm 136, Al Haggadah. And I invite you to just take a quick just scan down this list. I have it here in the Hebrew and over in the next page in the English. And just kind of notice, just kind of see the pattern of what are the things that are singled out here in this list, and in what ways, what are the similarities to our list in Dayeinu, and what are the biggest differences? I'm going to give you a couple minutes, just kind of look it over, see what you find. things that you noticed about this list of God's deeds. Just on its own, before we compare it back to today.
Well, it starts at the beginning.
Right. So there are very distinct sections. The first large section is creation. Right after its little introduction, right? We have Shemaim and the Aretz. We have the sun and the moon and the star. The Orim, right? The sun and then the moon and the stars. Okay, so the first section is creation, and specifically creation of the heavens and the earth and the heavenly bodies. Okay. Happy for anyone to kind of just.
Well, then it shifts into the Exodus story.
Right. Okay. So what do we have in the Exodus story? We have the Exodus story. We have.
Well, it's starting. It's going in order with the Exodus story.
In order, but it starts with the firstborn.
Right.
This is typical, by the way, of most sort of reviews of the events of the Exodus within Tanakh, that they don't mention any of the plagues except for the final one. Starts with the firstborn, bringing Israel out, right? That phrase Yad Chazakah and Zroa Netuyah, the hand and the outstretched arm. So we have the firstborn, and then we have the opening the sea, bring us across, and drowning the Egyptians. So firstborn, crossing the sea, drowning the Egyptians, part 2. And then anybody else wants to jump in and grab the mantle?
Well, I mean, it just takes us into the wandering in the desert and the subsequent the initial wars, and then I guess ultimately the giving of the land.
Okay. So it takes us through the travel in the desert.
Yeah.
What parts of the journey through the desert?
The battles.
Only the battles.
Yeah.
Right. Defeating kings, conquering the land and giving it as an inheritance to Israel. What's not here in this review? Going, even just
Sinai. Sinai isn't there.
There's no Sinai.
Yeah.
There's no Sinai or mitzvot or Torah or any of that. And without getting into the some of the biblical criticism questions of sort of at what point the sort of Sinai, the Sinai narrative and the Exodus narrative kind of got brought together into a single story. This text is listing demonstrations of God's might and power over nature. Right, power, and in fact, if you think back to if you think about the Gvurot bracha in the Amidah, right? Originally Gvurot was just about God's power, and the two images of God's power on which it's all based are Ken Talumatar, on God controlling forces of nature, and Meimit Umechayeh, controlling life and death. And in fact, what we have here is God striking our enemies, defeating our enemies in battles, and both in creation and a little bit in the later parts, God's control over and creation of nature, and in particular, sort of creating the heavens and the heavenly bodies. So this is a very so now think about this in sort of now alongside Dayeinu. First of all, what are the similarities with Dayeinu?
Well, it's a list.
It's a list, and it's a list of God's deeds with a repeating refrain and with very brief phrases and a repeated refrain. So in terms of form, they're very close, and this is almost certainly the sort of the model, the formal model that that Dayeinu is based on. One deed, refrain, right? It's one of the reasons it's so easy to sing, right? And this, and one of the reasons that that Psalm 136, if it weren't mired, it's somewhere in the middle of Psukkah Zimra, where nobody's gotten there yet, we would all sing it much more. This, the one Psalm 136 was always a big favorite of my family's to sing when I was growing up. And we have a final tune, and everyone would sort of like join in, very similar to Dayeinu. And it's a list that breaks down a single story into discrete little pieces, right? The creation separates out into the Shamayim and the Aretz and the sun and the moon and the stars, right? Just as it breaks down the leaving Egypt into components. Very similar to Dayeinu, which goes through the signs and the one verse says, I will destroy, I will do shvatim to them and to their gods, right? That becomes two separate lines in Dayeinu. So those are two big kind of parallels and similarities. So what are the main differences in what we see in Psalm 136 in here?
Well, Dayeinu seems focused on, post Egypt.
Okay, so it is, first of all, it is very definitely, it was written for the Haggadah. Its purpose, much more than Psalm 136, is to recount God's deeds and sort of really bringing us out of Egypt, really. Sort of starting from Egypt and sort of coming at the end of, or kind of narrating those events in Magid. Okay.
The Psalm 136 doesn't seem quite as personal. It's a more universal.
Okay, good. Well, right. Automatically, I think automatically the inclusion of creation, makes it feel universal.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, the most significant in terms of Jewish Jewish liturgy, verse in Psalm 136 is actually right down here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Noten lechem l'chol basar kili olam chasto. That image of, and in fact, I have here in a little. One of the things I note in the commentary here is that this text ends as it began, with God as responsible for the entire world and for all of creation and for all of God's creatures.
Mm.
It specifically goes back to God sustaining all life, and that sort of universal role becomes very important. So this Dayeinu is much more personal, right? Because the seder is much more personal. About we need to focus on and to remember what God did for us and why we should feel this very personal and emotional sense of appreciation and connection. Getting down to even the giving us the money, right? And it's also, right, it's about what God did for us and not just what God did, right? It's not about that God demonstrated God's might. It's what all of the things have in common is God's acts of kindness and love for us, acts of care for us. Even as the style is the same, it shifts from describing God's might to describing God's love for us. Okay. And you see that most clearly in the second half of the song, right? That when it gets past the sea, it doesn't go to battles. It goes to sustaining us, giving us man, right? Sort of sustaining us physically with food and water, and then giving us Shabbat, Sinai, Torah. And Shabbat is before Sinai and Torah because Shabbat is presented in chapter 16 before their arrival at Sinai. And ultimately, bringing us into Eretz Yisrael and all the way to building the temple. Right? The second half is all not acts of God's might, but God's gifts to us and kindness. So in that sense, the tone here is very different. And as the kind of closing text of Magid, it ultimately frames all of Magid in a different way. Right? Magid should not be about sort of focusing on celebrating either God's sort of just celebrating God's power or what God did to our enemies. It should be on feeling, celebrating, sort of internalizing all of these signs of God's taking care of us and God's love for us. Right? Feeling that sense of God's love and shepherding us is kind of is meant to be the takeaway. Okay. I want to I'm going to pause for any sort of thoughts about that, and then there's one more text that I want to spend at least a few minutes looking at because it is it's worth a look. But I want to pause for any thoughts, comments, questions so far.
I was talking, but I was muted. Sorry. One question. Are you expressing that that Psalm 136 is that whoever wrote Dayeinu was looking at 136 and said, ah, this is a good format here. And I'm going to, a good idea and a good format, and that's a good way to do this litany or this pute, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah,
Great.
for sure. I mean, even to the point of kama ma'alot tovot lamakom aleinu, right? That word ma'alot would not fundamentally, like, that's not the word that you would use, but it's a reference to the Shirei HaMa'alot, that section of exactly 15 psalms in the sort of last third of the book of Psalms that are meant to correspond to the 15 steps leading up to the temple. And you'll notice that the list in Dayeinu has exactly 15 things that God did for us. So in all of these ways, it's right. I guess the Paitan who sort of wrote this poem is drawing on these psalms as a.
Great, thank you.
Right, but primarily for the in terms of the form, right? And the fact that that comparison is really helpful in sort of driving home the idea that the form is about appreciating each one of these things individually, as opposed to, right, if we had the sun and not the moon and the stars, to say like, oh, we don't need the moon and the stars is, obviously wouldn't make any sense. Okay.
Great, thanks.
The other amazing sort of intertext for Dayeinu is Psalm 78. I don't know how many of you have spent any time looking at this psalm. It's surprising. Psalm 78, I'm just going to kind of jump through, just hit on a few things here. You'll notice that I have some just selections here to focus on a few key things, but I invite you to sort of go back and kind of open it up in full and kind of scan through the whole thing. The beginning you have here under whatever, section 4, says, I will expound a theme and hold forth on the lessons of the past that avotenu siprulan, right? That our ancestors told us, and we are not going to withhold from our children, right? Misaprimti lot Adonai, right? To recount the praises of God and God's power. Again, sort of that idea that these biblical lists tend to primarily focus on exhibits of God's power. Because God commanded our ancestors here in verse 5, God commanded our ancestors to pass on to their children, right? And them to their children, that they should always remember God's great deeds for us, and they should not stray from devotion to God. What is it describing here? It's literally, this psalm is literally written as a fulfillment of the commandment of the pasuk in Shmot, V'higarata levincha bayomahu. The verse says, you shall sort of tell them about what God did for us. That's that literally is the mitzvah that this psalm is talking about. God commanded our ancestors to tell us, and for us to tell our children, right? To always preserve this memory of God's deeds in the Exodus, so that we would always remain faithful to God. Just the idea that there is a text in Tanakh itself that literally offers a script for how to fulfill the mitzvah of V'higarata levincha is itself amazing to me. I just like, But then, what are we supposed? What are the things that's important to tell? So there are a few sections in this psalm, but generally, the early section is about things God did for us, and then kind of at the end, it comes back to things that God did to our enemies. God bakayam ba'avirem, right, opened the sea and brought them across, caused the walls of water to stand, right, led them with the pillar of cloud and the fire. Notice here, God gave them, God broke down rocks in the desert and gave them drink, right? Referring to drawing water from the rocks. And vayamter alehem man le'echol, rain down manna, and bread, so that they always had plenty, and then at the end it comes back to things that God did to the Egyptians. Now, but the thing is, the theme in here, I think I might have been a little bit too aggressive in excerpting this, so I'm going to encourage you to maybe take a look at the full text. The theme here is God did all of these things, and then the people rebelled. God did more things, and then the people were ungrateful. God did more things, and the people turned away. So the theme of the Psalms, God did all of these things here, and each time the people were not properly or sufficiently appreciative. So in a sense, this psalm, even as it is literally sort of talking about the mitzvah of the seder, its theme is how the Israelites in the rest of the desert journey didn't necessarily exhibit, sort of get the message properly. Okay. Now let's kind of turn back and think back to Dayeinu. How does Dayeinu kind of seem to play off of this text? The first thing you should notice is that this text, unlike Psalm 136, does have the man and the water. It has description of God sustaining Israel. Right, so it is much closer to Dayeinu, both in focusing on and starting from the Exodus and really focusing on what God did for us, Bnei Israel, as opposed to God's sort of might and power over the world. So, right, that's the sense in which Dayeinu, I think, is very, if its form is modeled on Psalm 136, its content is, in a sense, at least in part, modeled on Psalm 78. But Dayeinu is the inverse. What Dayeinu actually does is it offers a corrective to what's described in this psalm.
Mm-hmm.
God did each of these things, and each time the people didn't show gratitude. In Dayeinu, we do the inverse. We go through, we take each of those individual actions, like each one of these is sufficient for us to be devoted and to show gratitude. we are going to pause and express appreciation, gratitude at each stage in this journey for each of these acts of kindness. We are doing a kind of tikkun for Israel's failures in the desert. Now, what that means now, right? So is not only is we had this idea that that each one of these acts it's sort of worthy on its own, and now sort of adding to that as opposed to the Israelites, we are going to notice and sort of express and acknowledge each of those elements, and we see that connection in the fact that that Dayeinu is very clearly, like Psalm 78, focused on noticing God's acts of kindness for us and care for us. Now, with that, I want to just think for a minute about how Dayeinu relates then to the rest of Maggid. Because Maggid has been this series of first very short and then sort of a little bit more extended recountings of God's deeds. Right, the first time we just say we were slaves, Vayotzi, and God brought us, Vayotzieinu Adonai Misham, right? And God brought us out with mighty deeds. Period. End of story. Right. That's right. Then the second time we have, well, we started the story a little early. We were idol worshippers, and God, brought us out and brought us close. Right. Then we have the Midrash, which goes into a little more detail about both the oppression and God's kindness and God's act of bringing us out of Egypt. But all of those answers really stay focused on just the leaving Egypt. Maybe you could argue that that talking about our ancestors were idol worshippers and God brought us close to God, right, to God's service, is an allusion to Har Sinai, but really those tellings are all about the events of the Exodus itself. Coming here, right at the end of Maggid, Dayeinu, this children's song that I always think of as a bit silly or illogical. Dayeinu is radically extending our scope, our vision. Dayeinu is the one text that reminds us that that the closing of the sea was the end only of a chapter, which was only the first stage in a much longer journey. That when we're thinking about what it means to come out of Egypt, that ending that story when the sea closes is to miss so many crucial facets of that experience. And I think to remind us that are so many stories that we can and need to tell, each of each of which is kind of, those stories of our lives are sometimes nested with one within each other. There are stories of a particular moment, stories of a particular era, stories that that span a longer that span sort of a longer journey. So this is the text that brings all of those other elements: sustaining Israel in the desert, Shabbat and Torah, the land of Israel and the temple, into that story. What does it mean? When is our journey kind of complete? And honestly, lying behind this piyut, right? This list is the knowledge that this was not a right. This was not a smooth sailing process, and not that God brought us out and made everything easy. We know that there were sort of repeated times of crisis, times of alienation, times of anger. So the other thing that Dayeinu, I think, offers us, something that I'm really thinking about a lot as I come to think about sitting down on this Pesach, is Dayeinu offers us a narrative that encompasses and recognizes the ups and downs of our journey. That even as we're expressing sort of gratitude for each of these things, right, we're expressing gratitude at each point on the journey, even in those moments when there are ways in which we haven't gotten to yet to where we're going, or moments like this one where we sort of feel farther than we ever have felt in some ways from the place that we as a community kind of hope and sort of imagine ourselves reaching. That just as Jews have sung this song in so many different times of hardship, and being reminded that those moments of hardship, the moments of alienation, the moments of loss, are still part of that story, and do not negate all of the gifts that we received, and certainly ask us to sort of keep up our sense of being loved and cared for by God, even through those moments. Final thoughts, comments, questions, anything?
First, shkoyach for your last piece there. Very nice. I mean, for the whole thing, but I like the way you close it up. So thank you for that. Really very nice. I think you've actually, I don't know about anybody else here, but you've given me something to actually, and I thank you for this. You've given me something for myself, but something I can bring to my community in the package that you've delivered to us. I think it's wonderful to see the intertextualization, to see how everything connects, and then to have a message that fits for our time. So I thank you for that, really.
I have to say, thinking about Dayeinu, the last thing kind of started with a couple of articles a few weeks ago. I mean, just about like, can we say Dayeinu in these times? And feeling from sort of sitting with it is, it's Davka. These are the kinds of times Davka where that Dayeinu is written for. But even in the moments when when we haven't yet gotten to the next gift, we're still appreciative of the ones that we have received.
Yeah.
And keep the belief
Yes,
that
Koach.
we will get to the next. We have many
Josh, thank
brachot.
you so much for this amazing, excellent session. I put in the chat for anyone who's interested. Josh is doing round 2 next week. So registration link is in the chat and also in various emails from our RA. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day. Thank you.